is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This is episode number 655. My name is Marshall, one of your Limited Resources, and joining me on the line all the way from Denver, Colorado, it's Luis Scott-Vargas. Luis, you stoked for today's show?
Oh yeah, I've been looking forward to this one for a while. It's going to be really fun.
Yeah, we've got a really great show lined up, and in order to bring you the best possible version of said show, we've got our return guest for these episodes. We've got TBS back on the show all the way from a couple miles away from me now here in Seattle. Ben, what's going on, buddy? Welcome back.
You can now call me resident old person. That's probably works out really well because that's kind of the reason I'm here.
Yeah,
things are doing great. I'm happy that I think summer has finally broken in Seattle.
Yes.
Touch wood. I feel that the warmth that doesn't actually usually happens about a month ago, but it's
that's right. Here. Yeah, we've had a bit of a late start here, but we've got it going now. So if you're wondering what we're going to be doing today on the show, we're going to be going back in time, and we're going to be taking a look at Mirage and Visions, two very important sets, especially for people who listen to this podcast. We'll get into that and more as we take our little trip down memory lane. Before we do, let's mention our sponsors. First up, channelfireball.com. That's a place to go for everything magic related on the internet. If you need singles or sealed product, you can go over to the CFB marketplace to find the best prices, shipping, condition, whatever it is that you prioritize, you could find over at the CFB marketplace. And of course, if you're in the market for content, they have that too. You can head over to CFB Pro and check out the free side as well as CFB Pro side, which gives you in-depth strategic content from some of the best players playing the game. If you do end up picking up anything over at CFB, if you use the affiliate code LR, when you check out, you just type that into the little box. It lets them know that we sent you over and it helps out the show, and we do appreciate it. Show's also brought to you by FTX. That's the place to manage all of your digital assets. They're the regulated here in the United States version, FTX.US, and FTX.com outside of it, where you know that when you go there, that it's going to be safe. You can move around your digital assets as you see fit, and they're going to make sure that it's taken care of for you. So there you go. Make sure you check out FTX.com outside the US and FTX.US within the US. And I will remind you, by the way, that any type of investing or anything like that requires a lot of due diligence and a lot of research. Make sure that you consult an investment professional before making investments of any kind. Of course, the show is also brought to you by you via the Patreon. It's patreon.com/limited resources. If you'd like a thank you card and a sticker in the mail, any level that you sign up on the Patreon will get you that, as well as access to the Patreon feed for questions, question of the week, stuff like that. For this week, we're going to be skipping the question of the week, and we're also going to be skipping the Crack-A-Pack because we want to get right into business here for Mirage. This was the 9th expansion for Magic the Gathering. It came out in 1996. This was design lead and development lead, by the way, by the same person at Bill Rose, who, by the way, still works at Wizards of the Coast. It's a big set, 350 cards with 110 commons, 110 uncommons, and 110 rares. Keep it simple. The other 20 cards are basics. It took 3 years to develop the set by a group of playtesters to design their own cards and also use some cards from previous sets. And some noteworthy things about this before we get into the nitty gritty of what we want to talk about, that this set was the first of the block sets, which was one large set followed by 2 small sets, which were tied together both mechanically and thematically. Let's start there, gentlemen, because that is a big difference, and that's something that they actually carried on for years. I mean, this came out in 1996, and they didn't break that up until, it wasn't that long ago, 8 years ago or something like that, whatever it was, when they got rid of the block structure. How big of a change was that?
It's a pretty big change, where instead of, it was going for more like kind of cohesiveness between sets, because you saw a little bit of this with Ice Age Alliances, and maybe this is like where the seeds got planted for this. Mm-hmm. But I mean, you look at the first batch of sets, like you go from Alpha to Arabian Nights to Antiquities to Legends, and these things are like all completely different. Mm-hmm. And I think part of it is when you have such a fast release cadence, Magic, I mean, compared to a lot of games, especially back then, it's less true now that games, video games now patch every, sometimes every week or every 2 weeks, and people expect lots of like content drops. Back then, like, you bought a game on a CD and it didn't change ever. Like that was the game.
Yeah. What do you think, TBS, about the block structure?
I think it actually is a bit of a design nod to something that was concerning back at the time, which is like complexity of the game itself. So what the block structure allowed you to do was like to kind of like have mechanics last a bit longer rather than just be one off. Also, I think the block structure is just a nod to like creating more definition and design around like cycles and things like that as well. I mean, like cycles have always existed, but I think that what Mirage tended to do was to really reinforce cycles. This probably has some of the most amount of cycles. And I don't mean just hard cycles like cards that have the same type of output. I just mean like making sure there are gold cards from each color pair, and like there's a dragon from every color and things like that allow the set to actually kind of like, have some identity over time too, which is like you'll see some of that structure carry on in Visions and Weatherlight in subsequent sets.
Yeah, this set was the theme was kind of like an Africa-like theme. The plane I think was called Jamura, and but it is interesting that the cards were actually designed before that. Nowadays the process is very much aligned, or much more aligned than it was then, but the thematic elements were layered on the names of the cards, the art, everything after the fact. They were just card designs that came to the creative team, and then they layered on the thematic elements. Today, we're going to be talking about both Mirage and Visions. There is a third set that technically makes up the cycle in Weatherlight, but TBS, you felt that Weatherlight was a little bit of an outlier as they kind of eased their way into this block structure thing.
Yeah, no. So I think one, Weatherlight has less kind of mechanical carryover. Two, it also represented something that we'll see when we actually get to Weatherlight, which is it's the start of the Weatherlight saga, the story of Jared, Sisay, eventually Urza and Karn and people like that. And so they kind of used it as a much more story kind of focused set. Right. And just so the Vorthoses out there don't jump on us for something Marshall said, Jamura is actually not a different plane. It's actually a continent in Dominaria itself.
I was just about to say that.
Yeah, you were.
Yes,
Thanks, Luis. Right. Thanks for the save, TBS.
Look. I think it's really important. I'm not a Vorthos, but at the time, I really cared a lot about the storyline, kind of more than I do now in some ways, because it was just kind of newer and fresher and more interesting, at least to me.
Oh, really? I'm really enjoying the alchemy storyline where they apparently have a card that has 17 different versions. Anyways.
Yeah. Now, I'll go ahead, Luis. You have something to say?
Well, I was going to say part of what to go back to the complexity thing just for a second. Part of what cycles do is, and repeating keywords and blocks is, once you've mastered it, a new version of that is not quite as difficult to grasp, right? When you see three of cards in a cycle, the fourth and fifth, the complexity load is just lowered because you've already seen this a couple times. And likewise, when they introduce some mechanics, we're going to talk about them, right? Like flanking and phasing. Once Visions has those, it's not like you're relearning a completely new, mechanically new thing over and over again.
Yeah, and especially, now the appetite for this stuff is way higher, right? With Arena and things moving at like a digital pace, we can kind of churn through this stuff a lot quicker. But I think that they were much more cognizant of overloading players, which was with what is ultimately a very complicated game. Like Magic has a high barrier to entry, and they were probably still pretty aware of that. I mean, remember, this came out in 96. Magic only came out in 93, and that was like, the test versions, not even the real versions. I mean, it had only been out for a few years at this point, so they're still very much getting their sea legs under them. But let's get right to the big stuff here, because this is the set where, speaking of getting your sea legs under you and kind of understanding, okay, there's a block structure forming, we're starting to get an idea how things are going to be repeated over and over again going forward. They took a really big step with Mirage. They actually considered limited for this set. This is the first set, TBS, that actually had that in mind during the design portion.
Yeah, not only that, I mean, one, it was the first set that with limited, but there was a Pro Tour that actually had it as its pre-release, Pro Tour Atlanta, Pro Tour 4. It was, and when I say pre-release, I mean, technically there were no spoilers before this Pro Tour. It was sealed deck. So
wait, hold on a minute. You're using the words Pro Tour and pre-release in the same sentence. What are you talking about?
So the first time the general public got their hands on these cards actually was at Pro Tour 4 in Atlanta, and basically it was a sealed deck Pro Tour, like all the way up.
But were these the same event?
Yes.
Yeah, Marshall, can you imagine? You sit down for a Pro Tour, you're handed a starter deck. These are the cards you'll be building your deck from, and you don't know any of the cards.
Oh my God, that's like a dream.
It's literally my dream. Though, at the risk of dredging up some 25-year-old drama, there was one pro team that was rumored to have access to the cards beforehand.
Yes. That's tough.
It's really the problem, and it doesn't really kind of line up with how Magic is marketed now. But I think at the time, it was, one, a super cool idea. Two, I think if they can pull it off, it's like actually a really good challenge for like players. I mean, granted, you have all the kind of variants you get with sealed deck, but actually be able to kind of evaluate things on the fly and contextually, that's actually a really, really interesting kind of skill set that isn't tested very much in Magic.
I would love it, because not only do I not have to practice, because I don't want to do that anyway.
By definition.
Now I get to just think on the fly. And of course, back then you also had people who thought you could just play 13 lands in your limited deck. Like they didn't even understand a lot of the things we consider fundamental right now.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's super cool. And also just connected to that, this was actually the first set where there was a global pre-release after this set. It's like after the Pro Tour. So the Pro Tour actually was one weekend, and the following weekend, there was actually a big pre-release in like most of the major Magic centers in the world. I know there was one in Australia, and we all came down. At the time, it was like, I think it was like a 300 or 400 person pre-release, which was, tournaments of that size were just not seen in Australia at the time. And I remember just kind of like, it was so big. We were playing like the pre-release games on the floor.
You want to pick up, Luis? His connection's a little spotty today.
So for a lot of reasons that you couldn't do that sort of release anymore, right? Like, I mean, there actually was, the issue of some players getting access to the cards beforehand, but you can't conceal that kind of information anymore, as cool as that sounds. But combining that with the global pre-release event, it made Mirage one of the more hyped sets. And in fact, Mark Rosewater started something with Mirage that he continues to do. And you already we can look at like our live chat, right? We already saw people before we even talked about this mentioning it because it was so impactful. I remember reading it in the Duelist when Mara would do stuff like, in this new set, there's a 0-mana artifact that sacks for 3 mana of any color. There's a 1-mana 12/12 trample. And like he drops these like teasers without context that are so exciting. Of course, the joke in Mirage was the 0-mana artifact was Lion's Eye Diamond, you're going to discard your hand. And the 1-mana 12/12 was Ferexian Dreadnought, where you had to sack 12 power with the creatures. But going back, it actually ended up that both those cards were part of busted decks. So they thought they were getting us, and then they weren't anyway, because there was a lot of ways to abuse both of those things. But that teaser thing became an institution, and Mirage was one of the first sets that I remember, at least, seeing that kind of revealed in such a cool way.
TBS, you were saying that people were playing on the floor at the pre-release?
Yeah, and I mean, it was... for Australia, we were actually at the time a pretty small Magic country, but I mean, it was such a huge event, and it really had an energy that like I don't think I've really been to a pre-release that's kind of been like that. So I mean, as cool as the store pre-releases are now, I generally prefer kind of the olden days of like this huge pre-release that the whole community in an area came to, and it was like just like a really, really good coming together. So
I mean, TBS,
I wish we had those.
Remind me, when did you get to NorCal? At what point were you living there?
I was living in NorCal in 2010, so quite late.
Okay, because I think that the big pre-releases had stopped by then, though. Because I remember even similarly in like 2003, 2004, the pre-release for a new set, they would rent out the San Jose Convention Center and they would have 800-person pre-releases, and it had the same energy you're describing. And a lot of reasons not to do that, but I do miss those. And it is cool that Mirage kind of featured that coming onto the scene.
Yeah. And I mean, just to go back to the kind of the game setting, I actually think it kind of kicked off. I know we had Arabian Nights as kind of a set that kind of like worked on setting and things like that. This was the first time where they kind of like transplanted an Earth-like setting into the world of Magic, as in like translated it essentially. Because Arabian Nights is like just taking the story and moving it over. What they did here was like they said, okay, we want an Africa-like setting. And then they did a lot of research. You can see in a lot of the names and words and things like that. They just did a really good sense of like world building here, and it's still resonant now. Some of the characters that we are actually very familiar with, like Teferi, were debuted in this set specifically. I mean, he didn't appear as a card, but like he was referred to in many cards. I don't know. I felt like this was actually a really, really high point.
I mean, it was such a cohesive eye to flavor, which is actually blowing my mind. I didn't know that the flavor was added on after the cards were designed, because you wouldn't be able to tell from how good of a job they did. Like one of it is like they have the love song of Night and Day, which is like this epic poem that shows up in flavor text on a bunch of different cards, and it just fits so perfectly. And that's huge. And it's funny because Mirage, is a slam dunk for flavor, but also we need to talk more about what it means to be designed for limited, because people who have heard us the previous sets that we've gone over right on this show, where we talked about Alpha, we talked about Arabian, we talked about Legends, and we laughed about how obviously terrible it was. If you ever tried to do a booster draft in Legends that had one red common creature that could attack, for example.
Right.
It's because limited just wasn't like, this isn't a knock on the Legends designers in even though the Legends has some stuff that's like a little outrageous. Limited wasn't a thing. So why would you design for limited? People don't need 3 red common creatures. It's fine if none of them do anything in limited, because that didn't exist. Limited, by the time Mirage was in development, was something people liked to play. And I imagine something Wizards wanted to push more of. It just sounds genius, right? It's a way for people to buy packs. Every time you draft, you crack 3 packs. That sounds perfect. And it just becomes so much better once it's just every card, not every single card, but so many cards are playable and play well and are tested together. It's just a completely different universe.
Yeah. So, I mean, the important thing that makes something a limited set, like we haven't really explicitly talked about it. One is, as Louise kind of talked about, is like the number of creatures available at the common rarities specifically, but just throughout the set. Like, limited is defined by creature combat for the most part, and so making sure there's a lot of them around and they're kind of like balanced in a power level that's kind of within a certain band is obviously really important. Mm-hmm. On top of it, I mean, you have the counterplay that what are the removal spells? Like that ratio of creatures to removal spells is something that's really vital to limited, because that is the axis of interaction in limited Magic. Mm-hmm. And everything else kind of like is other stuff. But once you have that, you can that's what the basis of a good limited set, and making sure like they use cycles to make sure there's kind of like a lot of like balance between number of creatures, sizes of creatures, things like that. And you can see there's a lot of preciseness with where they've placed certain cards. They've made sure that colors that generally don't get a lot of common creatures like red and blue have a lot more creatures and viable kind of like creatures. And also they made the commons more playable. Actually, that's the other thing. Usually commons are like kind of garbage, and in this case, they actually kind of like up the general power level of commons to make sure that they don't get kind of eclipsed by uncommons and rares in most cases.
I mean, if you put a bunch of creatures and a bunch of removal, there's like really a pretty significant floor to how bad a set can play in limited, especially the bar was different in 1996. I mean, if they released Mirage now and we didn't know it was like, about original Mirage, it would get pretty panned in terms of limited play. Like Ray of Command is a common. That's a 3 and a blue instant gain control of a creature, untap it. And what would happen is you would attack your opponent with a 2/3/3s. They'd Ray of Command one and block the other because it was a temporary control, but it was an instant speed threaten, and it's just like, oh, that's just ridiculous. There was, Karavek's Torch, red X deal X at common, and this is back when the games were long enough that Torch would frequently just win the game because you just torch them for 10, that sort of thing. But it was just a groundbreakingly good set when it comes to like playing compared to all the previous sets, but it even holds up. Like I still stand by my statement that if they released it today, people would be like, what is this? This is, there's obviously these mistakes and it's broken or whatever. It still holds up pretty well. When they had Mirage flashback drafts on Magic Online, like, you have to keep the context in mind, but like, it's fun to play. It has good gameplay, and there's a lot of cool stuff going on. And the fact that they were able to get that right as the first of its kind, you always have to give more credit to kind of the pioneers, the groundbreakers, right? And Mirage, I believe, was that. I think we're not sitting here on this podcast talking about Mirage if they never decided, hey, Limited's really good, we should support it.
Yeah, and this laid the groundwork going forward for what has become seemingly quite a refined process, right? Like we don't really have a view into exactly how it works, but I mean, you can tell by how consistent they've been with the limited sets being quite good. It's actually, when we get one that isn't very good, we're kind of like, wait, what happened here?
Like Nuka Penna.
Yeah, right. It stands out a little bit where it's like, yeah, this didn't really hit that hard. And even then we're kind of a niche audience too, of people that want to draft, hundreds of times or whatever. So, they've really refined that down, but this is that first step in that direction. And this doesn't happen by mistake, right? If you just design cards that you think are cool, you're never coming up with a even remotely decent limited format. You're going to come up with the type of stuff that we've already talked about on these episodes of the show. And so, yeah, huge props for doing so and for moving Magic in this direction. Do you guys have any sense for why they did this?
I think they're trying to make Magic a sustainable game. I think there's a lot of choice. Like Limited is a format that it like helps the game kind of sustain, because I always say that Limited is actually one of the best formats because it allows for players kind of like old and new to have a relatively balanced interaction. Mm-hmm. And so I think they knew that they needed to have kind of like a format that allowed for new players to come in. And if you don't build for that format, you're not going to allow like that group of players to come through. And on top of it all, also, I think they were also looking for design sustainability. I know we've talked about like kind of blocks doing that too, but I generally think that they had this idea that design space isn't infinite. I think they were a bit conservative here, but in general, there's this kind of realization. It's like, okay, we have to kind of like be a bit more careful about like the types of like design space we're opening up, and making sure that we're actually using it properly and kind of exploring it all before we move on to the next thing. So those two things together, I think, was actually like really, really kind of transformational when it comes to like how these blocks basically move Magic forward as a game.
Is there a marketing reason? Like if you focus on limited, then that gives you sealed deck as well, which theoretically, I mean, that's what ended up becoming the de facto format for pre-releases, for getting people excited and into and cards in hand for the new sets. Do you think that there was a view of that as well?
Well, I think that you have to remember the context of the time too, where right now, if you go to like a local game store and you ask someone, hey, do you want to play a game of Magic? They're going to ask you, what format do you want to play? Do you mean Commander? Do you mean, Standard, whatever? Like, you're not, I came for the Modern tournament today. We were way more in 1996 in the space of, you go to your local game store and you both just have the decks that you brought. Yeah. Not a little bit format agnostic. And there was definitely a pretty big delta between the guys who'd been playing since 1993, who had dual lands and Shivan Dragons and Moxes sometimes, and the people who didn't. And Limited leveled the playing field in a pretty significant way, while also, the fact that you can just show up, buy your packs, and sit down and play this, yeah, I think there is that is a pretty strong advertisement. It's funny because when you have all the cards, limited is more expensive to play, right? You already own your commander deck. It costs you more to go draft at the shop than just play commander. When you don't have the cards, limited is kind of actually cheaper to play because you're sitting across from someone. Instead of having to dredge up, $2,000 for a modern deck, you can spend $15 and crack your 3 packs, and they have no advantage over you. It doesn't matter how many cards they have. They could literally have $1 million worth of cards.
Totally.
You're on the same playing field. And I think leaning into that probably was a smart move, though I don't remember exactly what their marketing looked like at the time.
Yeah. I mean, I think the fact that they had this pre-release concept, which is kind of a new idea. I mean, not like it wasn't untested, but it wasn't rolled out to this extent. And the fact that they made this set for limited specifically, I think those two things probably were considered together. Mm-hmm. Right? So it's like, okay, how do we make the biggest splash for our release? Oh, let's have everyone play at the same time. That sounds awesome, right? Okay, that's one thing. But then how do we make sure that playing the same time makes sense? It's a good experience. Oh, okay, let's make it limited. And so I again, we don't really have kind of a true time machine where we can actually kind of like ask the people what was the reason. And maybe we could ask Bill Rose one time. It's like, did you actually kind of like plan this? But regardless, it worked together very well. So much so that it was almost the model for decades. Right, so they kept this version of how to like release games until probably, only like 5-6 years ago when they really kind of like blew it up by making it store-based, making it kind of like more open.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I think the Mirage. I mean, you look at the individual cards. There's a lot of the ones. I mean, we were going through the set, and there's a lot of like really really cool cards. But I think its legacy is a structural thing. And it's kind of like an intention thing. And I think that's why it remains, to me, one of the most important sets when it comes to kind of design philosophy and honestly, the long-term success and failure of Magic.
Yeah, it's interesting because, the companies will try stuff out and often pivot away from them or keep the good stuff or whatever. But they really made 2 major strides with this set, with doing the block structure and then designing for limited, and they stuck with both of those, right? I mean, that was huge. Those are like big changes, and they actually stuck.
I mean, I was just going to say the biggest compliment you can pay, the biggest metric of success of this set was the things that they figured out in 1996 still happen. Like, yes, we talked about how the pre-releases changed, but that's just the structure of like who holds it, one central person or a bunch of stores. It's still the same thing. You still have a bunch of people excited showing up on Saturday morning to open sealed decks and play with the new set.
Yep.
And they're still doing limited, like limited is still a very popular way to play. And yes, they've moved away from block structures, I think for a good reason, but I also think the blocks did the thing that they needed to do for so long that you couldn't say it's anything but an unqualified success.
Yeah. Let's talk about a little bit more dialed in. The mechanics. The keyword mechanics that they introduced with this set, this is where we get to start going, one of them was flanking and the other one was phasing.
All right. Well, let me hop in here. I'll explain the mechanics and then I'll explain why I think they're both actually pretty bad mechanics, but that didn't hold Mirage back. So flanking is, so when a creature with flanking is blocked by a creature without flanking, that creature gets -1/-1 till end of turn. So this mechanic is really high on the onboard trick space, and it plays, I think, quite poorly. Imagine this. You're playing Magic. Your opponent attacks with a 2/2. You block with a 3/1. Then they say, okay, your creature dies. You're like, yeah, so does yours. So like, no, mine has flanking. Your thing died before it deals damage. Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. Well, I attack with a 3/3 flanking. All right. Well, I'll block with, it is flanking. Okay, I'll block with a 3/3 and a 2/2. And it's like, okay, well, they both get -1/-1. So now they both die. And it's like, oh,
right.
And it also, like, the fact that it doesn't work on flankers, so flankers can block flankers, is like kind of weird. Like, I guess the flavor is you can't get flanked, and flanking in this context, it is generally reserved for people riding on horses, or in the case of Joel Real Centaur, is half horse themselves, because the joke is that you flank them, you outflank them, you went around the side and you outmaneuvered them, and that's why they get a disadvantage in combat. Really bad. They brought it back, in Champions of Kamigawa with Bushido, where instead of -1/-1, it was now +1/+1 to your creature. Less of a problem there, but still kind of bad and doesn't fit with a lot of the design sensibilities of, hey, don't make mechanics where your opponents just put their card in the graveyard if they do it wrong straight up on board. And that was not something that Mirage cared about at all. They didn't care about that until like 2008 or something, or 2009. And then the other mechanic was phasing, where cards with phasing, creatures with phasing, were effectively undercosted, right? They had like Sandbar Crocodile was a 4 and a blue for a 6/5, which was outrageous for blue creatures back then. Mm-hmm. And even just big for creatures back then, right? Like for that cost. Like we're still very much in the era of spells trump creatures. You have Incinerate and Karavek's Torch and Ray of Command and Dark Banishing, and then you have 4 mana 3/3s with drawbacks sometimes. But what phasing does is at the start of your turn, it phases out until the start of your next turn. And it's a ridiculous mechanic because it's not in play in the sense that it can't be targeted. It's not affected by wraths. You can't block with it. You can't attack with it. But counters and auras on the creature remain. It's not getting exiled. It's very important. And it comes back and then it can attack right away because it was in play already, right? Like it's in play for that sense. And the part that kind of blows my mind is that phasing is back now. They've actually started to lean on phasing as kind of a reaction to a mechanic actually introduced in Visions. We'll get to that very shortly here, of enters the battlefield effects. It's a way to like exile a creature, flicker a creature, or remove it for some amount of time without re-triggering the enters the battlefield effects because it doesn't enter the battlefield. And I will admit, I thought phasing was awesome when I first saw it. I'm like, look at these awesome creatures you can get. They're amazing. But it just plays really badly. Like you have to remember your creature doesn't do really what you want it to do. It's just frequently disappointing. What do you think, TBS?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. There's some stuff I want flanking I'll talk about after, but just to respond to your phasing stuff. They took phasing away after these set of sets. But when they did bring it back, just to kind of clarify, they actually didn't bring back the like keyword phasing. They brought out the concept of phasing out. So like nearly every card in Mirage has just the keyword phasing, and it means basically it's there half the time, right? So and it was used as kind of like what we call like negative costing, right? So
it was a drawback,
it's a drawback costing. So you could do bigger things, as Louis was saying. Nowadays, what they use phasing almost exclusively as a reaction to you or your opponent doing something. So it's kind of like a protection mechanic, and so like essentially they're not using it the same way. So even though they brought it back, or at least the rule set they brought back, their application is like very, very, very different. And you can see the application in Visions. Actually, there's a couple cards that actually intentionally kind of like phase out when, they're targeted or you spend some mana or something like that. So I agree with Louis. Phasing is not a great mechanic, kind of like the way they executed it in Mirage. But the new version of how they use it is actually kind of interesting and does help us kind of like apply kind of like protection or tricks in a way that doesn't actually kind of like double down on come into the battlefield effects. So I think that's a really important use. With flanking, again, I agree. I don't think it's a great mechanic. And one of the things I remember at the time hearing is that the whole like flankers I don't get flanked by flankers is kind of like a conceptual idea that was connected to how flying worked, because flyers kind of work the same way. You have a flyer, it's unblockable except by another flyer. So the whole like idea of it didn't seem so far-fetched. It's like, oh, flankers, they're good against everything except flankers, which is kind of like, okay, you can kind of see the through line of how they decided that thing. The problem is in practice, there was just mistakes all over the place. And all the situations that Louis talked about happened constantly, and not just like on the pre-release day. Like I remember kind of like well into the kind of like the gameplay of flanking. People are still putting, blocking regenerators, like their 1 toughness regenerators on flankers, and then well, -1/-1 means you can't regenerate anymore. So like it goes straight from the graveyard, and it happened all the time. So
yeah,
it's one of those things you can see. And to be fair, creature mechanics actually quite hard to do. Like they're just kind of like inherently more limited in how to execute them, and a lot of that design space is already kind of used up. And you'll see a lot of like creature mechanics be essentially just things tacked on rather than kind of like things that involve combat itself.
Yeah.
So I think this is a noble effort, because I think making creature combat the focus of like Magic is generally a good way to push your power. It was just executionally. It was kind of a meh.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that stands out to me about it is, agreed, the execution didn't really come through, but you know what I like about it is it encourages people to attack with their creatures. And in these old limited sets, and this is the oldest limited set, it took them a while to kind of figure that out. If like if I just take a quick look, for example, at like the white creatures, the white common creatures or something like that, right? I don't have to go too far to take a look and to see that, like, just right now, I'll read the power of the white common creatures from this set. It's 1/1/2/1/2/1/1/2/2/0/2. Right. So like, and, admittedly, like a couple of these have flanking and whatever, but like, we're not talking, it was hard if somebody played a 2/4. Like, you're just like, oh, well, I don't have a white common that can get through that, right? Like, sorry, you brickwalled me. And as we know, it took them a while to get removal and stuff balanced out as well. And so, I kind of like the idea of saying, well, look, we're going to encourage people that says, look, your card doesn't do anything extra if it sits back, but if it attacks, it has a bonus. And that might encourage you to attack and sort of get the ball rolling for players who are, at a more early stage of development of the game, or frankly, they were just too shy. Like, they didn't want to attack. People would routinely just keep their creatures home kind of regardless.
And one of the reasons why the creatures are generally lower in power is they wanted to encourage longer games in limited. And so, like, flanking is a way of making something good attacking without actually increasing the power. And I think that's actually also important. So the number of turns, like with the 2/2 you have to attack is 10 times, right? So that doesn't change even if it has flanking or not. And so, like, if you made something like 4 power, okay, well, yes, you kind of solve the problem of like getting over a high toughness creature, but you actually also speed up the clock of the game. Yeah. So you kind of want to, like, again, execution, the details of it, not as great as you'd hoped, but this is done intentionally. And it's done basically to make more interaction in the game. And one of those interaction points is like, how many hits does the average creature or the average common creature take to actually kind of like win the game itself?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
go ahead, Luis.
If you look at like one of the things that the white creatures had was griffins. There's like a bunch of griffins. There's like 4 mana 2/2 flyers. And it's like, yeah, these things don't end the game like particularly quickly. So they give you a lot of room to play around in.
Yeah, what I really like, and I think the place to look if you want to see kind of where things were going for limited in this set and how it was designed, are actually the green creatures, particularly the green common creatures. They are very combat centric, not just because they have power and toughness, but also because it actually matters. There's cards in here that reference blocking, attacking, affecting combat, where if you look at the sets that we've already covered, that is often an afterthought, right? They're not really talking about like, if this thing gets blocked, then something good happens. It was more about, kind of top-down designs, flavor, stuff like that. But these ones, there's a 2 and a green 3/2 can't be blocked by black creatures. There's a giant spider variant, right? 3 and a green for a 2/4 that can block creatures with flying. There's an 8/4 trample for 8 mana, a common.
Crash of Rhinos.
Yeah. I mean, that's a cool design, and that really stands out, right? And, and then
I thought that card was busted. Okay.
Yeah, I still do for what it's worth. Yeah. But but again, Jungle Worm, 3 green, 5/5. For each creature assigned to block it beyond the first, Jungle Worm gets -1/-1. Again, we care about combat here. We care about how these creatures are going to tussle with each other. And, some more simple ones too. Wild Elephant, 3 and a green, 3/3 trample. But again, trample is mostly a limited mechanic. It's mostly my creatures are going to be crashing into other ones, and I'm going to get a little bit of a bonus for that type mechanic. And I really think that you can tell that they drilled down on that, right? You can really feel it when you look at these designs that they were focusing on creature combat way, way more than if you look at Arabian Nights or something like that, where, they were looking at it and going, well, this is a character from an old story. Was he big or was he small? Right? We'll make him a 1/1 because he was a little guy. That was kind of the criteria. And, that's completely changed here for this set. Go ahead, TBS.
Yeah, just, one other new thing they actually brought in with this set was actually enemy colored cards. I mean, technically the dark had a couple.
They had dark Heart of the Woods.
Yeah, but as a cycle and as a feature of a set, this is the first time that they actually had enemy colored cards. In Legends, there were friendly pairs and wedges.
Mm-hmm.
This is the first time that blue, red, black, green, etc., kind of were actually kind of cards of themselves, and there were quite a few of them. And I mean, even to this day, a lot of those cards still have some resonance. Frenetic Efreet, Cadaverous Bloom. These are cards that still actually kind of occupy the mind of players who played during the time because they were just so cool at the time. And also, there's a lot of stories, surrounding some of those. So I just wanted to kind of point that out because, I actually think one of the things that Mirage took from Legends and Ice Age Alliances to some extent was that gold was a cool concept, but they were much, much more smartly kind of positioned and much more structured than I think it was in previous sets.
So in your mind, this is what Legends was trying to do, but they actually did it rather than spit out a bunch of random weird.
It did what Legends was trying to do in that harnessing the power of gold being cool, which it did, but also the designs were actually good for the most part.
Yeah.
And they introduced a much heavier, kind of theme of enemy color designs, which are really cool. I mean, you even see Energy Bolt is X red white sorcery, deal X, gain X.
Mm-hmm.
And Lightning Helix is I would say a spiritual successor of that card, right?
Totally.
And it's just gold cards are cool. I remember these cards being incredibly cool, and they really did deliver. Savage Twister, these cards had some real meat to them. A lot of them packed a punch, whether it was in limited or constructed.
Are there any specific cards that we want to talk about? Because I do want to make sure that we cover Visions before we take off. But are there any either big picture stuff or specific cards you guys want to hit before we talk Visions?
It would be remiss of us to talk about Mirage without talking about Hammer of Begarden. I think this card is actually probably the coolest kind of flavor, power, art combination. It at the time it was awesome. Even now it's awesome.
What does it do, TBS?
Okay, sorry. It's a red 1. It's a sorcery. It does 3 damage to a target. And then during your upkeep, you can play red 2 to put it back into your hand.
Yeah.
Now, this was one of the first times that they really used recursion on a card on itself. So it was wow, I can, with 8 mana, I can bolt something every turn. And there was actually a lot of decks that were structurally created around Hammer. I mean, Counter Hammer was a deck at the time where it was just a counter deck, a very heavily blue control deck that had Hammer as the win condition. And there's some other variants, but Hammer was the first of its kind. And on top of it all, it has the art is by, I think, Ron Spencer.
It is Ron Spencer, yeah.
Yeah, and let me tell you, everyone should have a look at this card. This card is an awesome piece of art. It thematically fits it well. It's if you remember kind of like Thor, he's like swinging his hammer and it's so heavy that he needs to like spend a bit of time to like lift it back up and then swing it again.
Yes.
And that's really cool. That's such a cool idea.
That
right?
is awesome. And built-in inevitability is cool, and graveyard recursion's cool. Yeah, this card's awesome.
So good.
Frenetic Efreet is also a huge one. This is a 1 blue red for a 2/1 flying, and you can pay 0 to flip a coin. If you win the flip, it phases out. Otherwise, you bury it. And
they love coin flipping stuff back then.
Well, A, yes, and then B, you might not think it from me reading that card. This, I don't know, TBS. You were a competitive player earlier than I was. Is this the best card in Mirage, or is Hammer's comparable?
No, I think at the time Hammer made a bigger splash. Frenetic Efreet was absolutely, it was in the standard type 2 decks at the time, and actually extended. It was actually had some presence as well.
I mean, like the top 5 is like something like Hammer, Frenetic Efreet, Wildfire Emissary, right? Like, you know, my point is that this card was amazing. I don't actually think most Magic players are super into straight up flipping a coin to see who wins or loses games, but Frenetic Efreet sure did make a big impact, and it's pretty funny because we think of coin flip cards as mostly jokes, and I think for good reason. Coin flip cards generally are not that strong. This is probably the all-time strongest coin flip card, and I have to imagine they learned some lessons from that. Of yeah, maybe putting high power level plus coin flipping together is not exactly what we want to do.
Yeah. One of the cards that's had kind of a notorious reputation is Flash, which is 1 and a blue instant. Choose a creature card from your hand and put that creature into play as though it were just played. Pay that creature's casting cost reduced by up to 2 if you cannot bury the creature.
A card's so good they made it a keyword.
Yeah, indeed. But, you know, this is like, just to give you an example of this card's legacy. Well, speaking of legacy, it's banned there. It's also restricted in Vintage and banned in Commander. Right? So, like, this is the card that you look at it and you just go, like, I'm going to do something stupid and cheaty with this. And that's exactly what people did. Another one that's had... Maybe it's one of the most visible. I think that the cards that I think about, the most when I think about this set are Lion's Eye Diamond, which is probably one of the most, this card's awful, like one of the worst cards you've ever seen until you figure out what you could do with it. And then it's like, okay, well, close enough. And
easily the most expensive card in Mirage, by the way.
Busted.
It might be worth more than the rest of the set put together.
Yeah,
There you go.
It's definitely over $100 right now.
Over 100. It's a couple $100 at the very least.
Oh, really? I'm not keeping up to date.
The height was probably, I think it hit at some point like 700, but you know, it's like maybe, I don't know, 300 or something right now.
Current mid is 546.
Yeah. Okay.
But to be fair, this card is bad. Like,
yes,
any normal usage of this card is bad, and so it wasn't until kind of like really kind of Yawgmoth's Will got printed a few blocks sets down the road.
Yeah,
did the card have any sort of impact into how like Magic? And so people were right. This was literally a bulk rare. I remember buying 25 of these for $1 because I thought that it was going to go up in price.
Wow. Please tell me you still have those. No.
I thought I was brilliant, right?
That's pretty good, dude. Like, I'm not going to lie. That is pretty good.
10x.
Yeah. I mean, and the joke here, of course, is, all right, you want a Black Lotus? Here you go. Right? Like, you see what you can do with this. And it turns out Magic players are very creative. And when the right cards came along, they broke it. Another card, there's 2 others that I wanted to bring up. One of them is Ferexian Dreadnought.
Yeah, this is one of my favorites. You know, you want a little bit of trivia. So first of all, the card is, again, a 1 mana 12/12 trample, but you have to sack 12 power worth of creatures or it dies when you play it. So obviously, like, you know, a pretty big drawback. In the hands of none other than Paul Cheon, this actually carried the U.S. national team to a world championship victory in the team portion.
Wow, look at that.
2007. 2008. And in Legacy, the combo at the time was Stifle. So you counter target activated or triggered ability. you can pay 1 mana to play the Dreadnought, then you pay 1 mana to stifle it, and you end up with a 12/12. There's also Mask Knot in Vintage. Illusionary Mask was a 2 mana artifact that basically gave creatures in your hand morph, and you got to flip them up equal to their casting cost. And so you could play the Dreadnought. You could actually play it for 1 because it didn't make you pay 3 for the morph. It was kind of a weird old card. Mm-hmm. You could play it face down for 1 mana, then you flip it up for 1 mana, or you flip it up by just attacking with it. Actually, sorry, and it ended up being just like a basically 1 mana 12/12 once you had this mask out. So that was what people ended up doing like to good effectiveness. I still remember it back then because Mirage was about the peak of my like. I'm an invested player playing a lot, but not coming anywhere near tournaments. Like, this is why I kind of defer to TBS about what was going on in tournaments back then. I was trying to do things like cast Tidal Wave, which is a 3 mana spell to put a 5/5 wall into play till end of turn, and then put Righteousness on it, giving it +12/+12, and then flashing in, finding ways to make Dreadnoughts and stuff like that. Like, they're just ridiculously terrible.
Build your own. Yeah. Yeah, and the other cards, by the way, were the ones that I think of are the Tutors cycle, the Mystical Tutor, Enlightened Tutor, Worldly Tutor, particularly. Those ones really stood out to me.
So they were like, hey, let's make a fixed Demonic Tutor. And of course, Vampiric Tutor actually showed up in Visions, but it's a cycle of 1 mana. So like blue is Mystical Tutor, instant. Go get an instant or sorcery, put it on top of your deck. Enlightened Tutor got artifacts or enchantments, and Worldly got creatures, and they did they did good work then, and even now, like these cards still got played. Mystical Tutor got banned in Legacy, many years later, 20 years later, 15 years later. So it turned out even skipping a draw step was still pretty powerful, and these cards were very fun to play with because, again, for people who didn't know power level like myself back then, this read like a tutor to me. Like the fact that I had to skip my draw step doesn't really enter the equation.
Right. I don't think that was really a factor for people then. It was just about getting the card that they wanted. All right. We've got to talk about Visions before we take off here, because Visions did give us the greatest gift in the history of Magic, of course. And it came out not that long after Mirage. It was the next set. So February 1997. It's a small set. It's 167 cards total in it. It did bring back both flanking and phasing, and reintroduced, let's get the real fun rolling here, cumulative upkeep as well. Bill Rose led this design team on top of it. And Luis, the nickname for this, and this really does show us the block structure sort of behind the scenes, was Mirage Jr.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of carried on what Mirage started, this continued. It was not a set that was dramatically different. In fact, if you were to like shuffle a bunch of Mirage and Visions cards together, you wouldn't think like, oh, these cards don't fit together. You would think that they're, have a lot of the same stuff going on. They had griffins, they had phasing, they had flanking, they had a lot of cycles, charms, etc. Vampiric Tutor to close out that cycle, etc. And Visions, one of the things that's really notable about Visions, it actually led to the first truly excellent combo deck, Pros Bloom. So this was a Prosperity, Cadaverous Bloom. Prosperity's in Visions, Cadaverous Bloom is in Mirage. And this is really, when I tell you how this deck works, it's really going to show off just how cool it was that this existed with basically no idea by the designers that this was possible. And that's what's cool about Magic. It's not, hey, here's the Goblins deck that we seeded, right? Yes, Magic has some of that, and that is good because you want people to have good building blocks and obvious decks to make, right? Where it's like, we put Goblin War Chief and Goblin Sharpshooter and Goblin Power Driver in the set. You're supposed to build a deck by putting all those together. Perfect. The Pros Bloom deck was mind-blowing because A, it was great. It was extremely strong. And then B, it was this like wild combo. So what it did is Prosperity is X and a blue sorcery. Each player draws X cards. Cadaverous Bloom is 3 black-green for an enchantment where you can exile a card from your hand to add green-green or black-black. So the base combo of these is it costs 1 mana to draw a card off Prosperity, and you can pitch a card for 2. So clearly, right, you got an engine there where you're like, all right, I'm going to cast Prosperity for 5, pitching a bunch of cards, and then I'm going to Pros Bloom, pitch those to Cadaverous Bloom and keep doing it. But that's not where it ends. Squandered Resources, which is a proposed name for an upcoming podcast here, is black-green for an enchantment that lets you sacrifice a land, to add 1 mana of any color that land could produce. So you could sack a forest to add a green, sack a swamp to add a black. It also has one of the greatest flavor texts of all time. He traded sand for skins, skins for gold, and gold for life. In the end, he traded life for sand. And
It's a bad trade.
as a side note, the flavor text in these sets are just incredibly off the charts good.
Yeah.
Like you should take some time reading it. As I have both sets open and I'm kind of scrolling through, it's just like, wow, these cards, they just have amazing flavor text. And then there's Natural Balance, which is like a 2 green. And what it did is it let you put up to 5 lands into play. So you basically got to sack your lands. Well, it had part of it, which was your opponent had to sack down to 5 lands. That didn't matter at all. But also anyone who had 4 or fewer lands, they could search for enough basics to get them up to 5. So what you do is you cast Scorn Resources, sack all your lands, cast Natural Bounds, put 5 lands into play. And they weren't tapped. And then you could tap them, sack them. Basically this huge mana engine, right? And then you had the tutors to go get, and you end up by casting a big drain life on them. And, this was a deck famously played by Mike Long, where he ended up having Cadaverous Bloom on his lap at, I think it was PT Paris. And, Mike Long stories are a different thing. But this combo deck was sweet. I remember hearing about this, and it's just blowing my mind that all these cards fit together. It's like it was designed, but it very clearly was not.
This is the first combo deck that I was aware of when I was playing, and I tried to get the cards together because I couldn't understand how it worked. And so I got like one each of the cards and like had them in front of me and then started to see, like by working it through myself, how it went. Do you remember that combo being a big thing, TBS?
Yeah, I mean, it was a big combo. I would say it had the biggest splash during the Mirage Visions constructed kind of timeline, or Weatherlight a bit later. Its standard footprint was present, but not overbearing. I think there was enough tools in standard to make sure that like counter spells were available in standard. So it was just a little bit harder to kind of get through. And there wasn't cards like Duress or Thoughtseize basically to kind of like, clear the way as much. I mean, the original version by Mike Long used coercion to protect it, and as you can imagine, 3 mana is a big difference from one mana. It's kind of placed as a really important combo deck, or the first of the kind of modern combo decks, is undeniable. It worked in a way and worked with principles such as like kind of like the going off piece of it was unlike any kind of combo deck beforehand, because combos used to be like cards that had a lot of synergy together before. Now this is actually kind of sequencing a set of cards together that basically created more resources than the previous iteration. And right. I think that's actually like a really, really important kind of thing that you see nowadays in kind of like things like Storm and other combo decks like it.
Yeah.
But it was at the time, it was like, this isn't Magic. This is like people were really, I mean, I remember some people in my play group were like outraged this is actually possible in Magic, because it didn't play, in a way that could be interacted with the way that, Lightning Bolt could.
Well, and the thing that stood out to me at the time, I remember, was that it took that leap of faith, right? Where like before, if you would do a combo, it would be because you got the cards into your hand to do the combo. But in this, you would combo off with just Prosperity, right? And do like, you would do like make a whole bunch of mana and then go, okay, I don't have anything left. I'm going to Prosperity for, 10. Whoop. And then now I can do this, and I've got enough mana to do this, and I'll float the mana and all of a sudden you would then continue the process over. And that felt like cheating, like from both sides, right? Like the other person's like, but you didn't even have anything, and you didn't even know if you were going to get the right pieces for it. We understand combo decks now have an inevitability when you do the thing that they're going to do. Like the Storm deck starts going, you get up to 90% pretty quickly once you get the first sort of big burst over and you're not interrupted. But back then it didn't feel like that. It felt like they were getting lucky every time, and that they were just throwing a bunch of cards in their hand and see what happens, even though we know now that that wasn't really the case.
Yeah.
I will say that as someone who didn't play in tournaments, this deck was huge net upside for me because I thought it was so cool. I didn't have to sit across the table from it though, so
yeah, and hey, that was me too, Luis, because I played during this time and I didn't play in tournaments either. I was just fat. I mean, I was a total Johnny, right? Like I just thought that these things were so cool that you could even find these and do these things.
Yeah.
So, TBS, you want to explain the 187 creatures? Because it's funny because this, speaking of things from Mirage that have endured, they discovered a core mechanic of Magic in the set. In Visions.
Yeah.
How about Visions, right?
Yeah. This is sorry.
When I say Mirage, I mean Mirage Visions.
Yeah.
So Visions was really remarkable, and in hindsight, it's amazing that they went through 7 or 8 sets without actually doing this significantly. It's the first set where they released Enter the Battlefield creatures. At the time, they called them 187. This was actually popularized by a group of players back then. 187 is actually the I think the police call sign in LA for murder or something like that.
It is. Yeah. I mean, that was a rap thing too. Yeah.
Right. So basically it was okay. So anyway, the key version, the key cards that are part of this cycle was Necrotile, Man of War.
It's Man O' War, not of War. Yeah. Don't mispronounce Man of War on this podcast. That's Man O' War. Oh, that was nice.
And the other one that was kind of big was Night of the Mists, and it was not that it was big in kind of the context of the set itself. I just want to do a little bit of self glorification. So Visions is actually the first Pro Tour that I actually was the set at the first Pro Tour that I actually played at in 1996. So
cool.
This is kind of really
where was that at?
It was at Pro Tour New York, but it was actually in Rye Town. I don't know if for those who know the Northeast, it's about 2 hours out of New York in upstate.
That's
and it was
awesome.
actually paired with 5th edition, not Mirage for some reason. It was 5th Ed Visions. Anyway, but actually the qualification round that came to that Pro Tour was Mirage Visions sealed and then top 8 draft, and so I have a very kind of strong kind of emotional connection to these sets, and but the 187 creatures are part of that too, because it brought into really kind of strong focus a concept that was only in its kind of nascency beforehand, and this concept of tempo. Now we talk about tempo all the time. But Man O' War at the time was this is the kind of a cute creature. Sorry, Man O' War. It's blue and 2. It's a 2/2. Comes onto the battlefield and then returns a creature to its owner's hand. Now, this is not card advantage, and card advantage at this time was a fairly established kind of pillar of Magic kind of strategy. So it wasn't clear that it was actually, very good. It wasn't bad. It was, it's clearly better than a 2/2 that doesn't do anything. But the concept, what it created was this idea that Magic games are a game of time. You have a certain set of resources you get every turn, and you have to kind of manage your mana in a way to maximize that. And if you're able to make your opponent waste mana in any meaningful way, so having to recast a creature that they've already cast before, you get an advantage that you can press in some way. You can make another attack. They won't be able to play another spell on a later turn. And this was really, really manifested itself in Man O' War, and to a lesser extent, though this was a bit later, Memory Lapse, which actually was
literally about to say the same thing.
Yeah. and Memory Lapse itself was obviously in Homelands as initially, but it basically was an afterthought in Homelands, and when it was kind of paired with cards like Man O' War, and it was actually part of a really, really big standard deck called Forgotten Orb, where you would actually use Man O' War and Memory Lapse, and then before they got to recast their creature, you'd play a Winter Orb, which basically was a 2-mana artifact that was part of a Revised at the time, and you could only untap 1 land a turn, so you couldn't even replay the card that actually got bounced to your hand.
I was going to say memory lapse is 1 and a blue, counter a spell, put it on top of its owner's library.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that this was actually the set that kind of like really brought it all together, with Mana War being kind of the star of that strategy. This is an idea that like goes not just limited and constructed to this day, right? So this is again another foundational piece that previous to that really wasn't part of Magic, and it really kind of changed the theory of what like card advantage and like all the different advantages and all the strategies you could do to kind of like win a game of Magic. This was a new one.
I mean, there was debates of like, is memory lapse even good at all? They just get to redraw the same card. You don't actually stop the card. And even without combining stuff like Winter Orb, it was obviously just a brutal card. And we know now with Remand and stuff like that, like memory lapse would be way too good. Like it actually got banned in Historic when they put it in the Mystical Archive. Because it turns out 2 mana to just basically take up their turn is very good.
Yeah.
And I mentioned earlier how, Mike Long got caught with a Frostbloom in his lap. I want to give him credit because he made one of the best plays I'd ever heard of at the time. They featured it in The Duelist. This is our Magic internet back then, right? The Duelist. Yeah. So he had Kaervek's Spite, which was a card. It's black, 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 instant. Discard your hand, sack all your permanents. Your opponent loses 5 life. Mm-hmm. So a very powerful card, right? If you have, if you can get them down to 5, and he had Kaervek's Spite, and in order to play around memory lapse, he floated 6 mana, cast Kaervek's Spite on his upkeep, and his opponent had memory lapse, and he could, if they lapse it, he just redraw it, cast it again, because back then mana floated from your upkeep to your draw
that's
step.
Crazy.
And I remember reading that, and it's like stuff like that did show you that Mike Long was way ahead of the curve in terms of play skill as well as everything, as deck building, everything else. I mean that part wasn't great, but like you can't really talk about him without, I think, admitting that he was one of the best players in the world at the time.
And he won a PT.
I'm not saying that.
Who knows how? Yeah, but but going back to what you were saying, TBS, about the ETB creatures like Necrotal, which is, by the way, 2 black, 2/1 first strike, and when it ETBs, you destroy a non-artifact, non-black creature. These were some of the first ones that we really saw the direction that Magic would go, right? Because basically, one way to conceptualize these cards, right, is that it's a creature with a spell attached to it, right? So Mana War has Unsummon attached to it automatically. So people would start to break it down like, okay, well, if I'm willing to pay blue for Unsummon, which is what it cost in, Alpha, would I pay 2 mana of, 2 generic mana for a 2/2? And at the time, it would be like easily, right? Like you just didn't really get cards like that.
2/2 that draws a card because you got both cards in one.
Right. And then exactly. And now you combine them and you're like, wow. Right. And you really start to see how powerful that is. Necrotal, is effectively 1 and a black for a 2/1 first strike with terror attached to it for an additional 1 and a black. And all of a sudden, you fast forward 10, 15 years and there's just a litany of creatures that are like this, right? Where it even moved further and further in that direction, away from activated abilities and the really powerful stuff that really stood out for decades there were creatures that have enter the battlefield abilities. And this is the first time that we really see those show up where you're like, okay, these can't be ignored.
Well, I think one thing that's important at the time is that creature removal spells in general were just like so much better than creatures. And so like it was really, really hard to kind of untap with the creature and have it live or to attack or use an activated ability. So
right.
What these cards did was they got their value up front, or at least some of their value up front. And I mean, now we talk about that all the time is that, this is how you get your incremental advantages.
I mean, one of the struggles that Magic went on, had for many years once they realized this was, how do we make creatures that are good that don't have ETB abilities that cost like 4 or more mana, right? Baneslayer Angel was groundbreaking into like, hey, well, you can actually pay 5 mana for a creature and not immediately draw a card or two. Because for a long time, the only creatures playable and constructed that cost 4 or more mana were ones that immediately had an impact. Your Muldrifter type cards, your Primeval Titans. And that actually ended up being a problem. But back then, when these were first out, it's like, oh, this is awesome. Look what these do.
Yeah, by the way, absolutely. Uktabi Orangutan too. We can't We can't disrespect. Also, Una Fricker does the artwork for that and for Man of War. So she got hooked up with some really nice ETB creatures coming in. They continued the the gold cards over as well. They had some fun with it and some not fun with it. We mentioned Squandered Resources. That's not a particularly fun Magic card on any level. But like there's a card called Pygmy Hippo, right? Like just kind of goofy stuff like that. Some cool top-down stuff like Army Ants, cards like this started showing up as well. And then really, though, you know, I tend to think of blue and red from these sets. I don't know if you guys have that too, but I always think about cards like Hammer of Bogarden, Sequata Lancer, Man of War,
Actually,
Memory Lapse.
Speaking of the red cards, I think we can't really talk about Visions specifically without talking about Fire Blast. Fire Blast, like it's such a defining card of the era. It came at a time where red decks were actually probably hitting their primacy for the first time. You have the deck that colloquially known as Sly, which is about a mana curve deck, and it actually turned much less into a mana curve deck and much more into a burn deck at some point. And part of that reason is Fire Blast. So Fire Blast is red 4. Do 4 damage to a target, but also you can alternatively sack 2 mountains to actually to cast the spell as well. So basically there was this critical amount of damage that these red decks could put together on a very, very fast pace before a lot of decks could actually get set up or defend themselves in any meaningful way. And like Fire Blast was so good at just kind of like, oh, I just kind of turned the corner, no, I'm dead. Because your opponent burned you out. And it was, at the time, naked aggression was just not also a really known strategy. In fact, again, we talk about like the spells being better, the pinpoint removal being better than the creatures. And so for the longest time, control decks were actually really dominant, or like decks that basically were answer decks. And Sly was actually one of the first decks where it was like extremely proactive and really trying to end the game as fast as the game is possible. And again, this is kind of like the precursor to a million red decks that came after that. And it's really, really important to kind of acknowledge kind of like what its position is. I mean, Fire Blast is still a really, really good card for the mono red decks in Cube. It's like one of the best cards you can have in Cube because for the same reasons that it was good back then.
All right.
I mean, that's why Cube's so sweet. It's it gets to be the victory lap of, it's kind of like the Hall of Fame for Magic cards, right?
Yeah.
Like, are you like, you have to have a pretty high power level to make it into Cube, and it's just all these cool throwbacks. You can't, I think, claim that a lot of the people who draft don't get value out of Cube by seeing the cards that were impactful many, many years ago. Yeah,
I like that idea of can you hang, right? Because like these cards also are being tested by the new cards, and let's just say nothing's testing Fire Blast anytime soon. It's one of the best burn spells ever. All right, well, we got to wrap up here, gentlemen, but I want to give you each the floor for a minute to let us know what you think the legacy, the impact of Mirage Visions has been. What impact has it had on our game? Going back all the way to the mid-late 90s.
I think as we talked about before, it's a very, very kind of design push towards limited. It's the reason this podcast exists, and it is like I would say that there's almost no Magic players that play zero limited. Okay, like
actually, the reason the podcast exists is cold hard cash in Marshall's bank account. That's the reason.
Hold on, where's my cut?
Yeah. We weren't going to tell him that, Luis. Yeah,
but it's and I think that like exploring that and kind of codifying a lot of the kind of rules and pillars and kind of just design sensibilities that make limited work is the kind of the lasting legacy. On top of that, I actually think we talk about like weaving story into kind of gameplay, and even though as Louis said before, the cards were actually mostly designed before the story itself. I mean, this is kind of a masterclass of like having the whole set feel like a world, really immersing yourself in that world. And like, let me tell you, the art on Mirage cards is beautiful now, and I would say I would put it against many sets. And in fact, I would hazard to say that Mirage or Mirage Visions may be kind of consistently the best art of all of Magic.
Ooh.
And
Okay.
I actually haven't really kind of looked at it. It's possible like something like not Ravnica, Innistrad kind of like might fight for that, because I do have a lot of good resonance there. But I think Mirage is really high on like best art average as well. And I think there's so many little cool mechanics. It's a very exploratory set. There's a lot to look at, a lot to consider. A lot of the rares are kind of like oddballs, but not oddballs in the way of like, oh, I'll never play this. It's like oddballs and like, oh, how does this make me think about Magic?
Yeah,
I actually think it's really great in that way. So that's the lasting legacy for me. I think this is like an all-timer. It's in Mirage itself is in my top 5 of all time set size.
Okay.
And I think. And so it kind of continues to amaze me, even though some of the cards may have been eclipsed when it comes to power level by now.
What about you, Luis? What's the lasting legacy, and is this an all-timer for you too?
Clearly an all-timer, and what I think is so awesome about this set is they tried a few things, right? They designed for limited. They've kicked off a block. They did the whole big pre-release thing, and they were rewarded for it so well that those things became just core parts of Magic, even as so far as like the enters the battlefield abilities, the 1/7 creatures, like Mirage was just the progenitor of all these things, and its lasting legacy is like, was this Alpha is the most impactful set of all Magic, because not only was it the first one, as we talked in great detail about, it laid the groundwork in such fantastic ways. Mirage might be the second best set or most impactful set in terms of like the future of Magic of all time. And it's just pair that with somehow also being like a slam dunk in terms of like flavor and setting and art. It's just, if I were Bill Rose, this would be one of the things I would be like the most proud of, in terms of Magic accomplishments. Obviously he's got tons, but this thing, and everyone else who worked on it, like it's really hard to overstate how good it was.
Yeah, and for me, of course, these two sets gave me so much, right? Limited, like modernized limited, which is one of my favorite things to do, and of course, Man of War as well. So it gave it to me all. So thank you to Bill Rose and the team for taking the big leap here and putting these standards into place that ended up paving the road for many of the things that I love about Magic. That's going to do it for this episode of the podcast. First off, I want to thank TBS for coming on. TBS, where can people find you if they want to catch up with you, your Magic thoughts, what you're up to?
Generally, I'm spouting off on Twitter, probably ill-advisedly sometimes, but I like to kind of interact.
No, your Landbox tweet was really good. That discussion was great. TBS asked if you found some Arabian Nights mountains, they're worth a couple $100 each, in the land box that lands were being sold for $1 each at a store. What would you do? Would you just buy them? Would you tell them? And then it was really cool hearing from all the people who would buy them for $1, and then all the people who lied and said they wouldn't buy them for $1. So I really enjoyed that.
Yeah. So hypotheticals, Magic stuff over at TBS Dash.
At TBS Dash. You can interact with me if I'm salty towards you. Please don't take it the wrong way. It just means that you are wrong.
Wow, that about sums it up. If you want to find Luis and I's social media, I'm Marshall_LR and Luis is LSV. You can find everything related to the podcast over at lrcast.com. And we want to thank our sponsors. That's Channel Fireball and FTX for their continued sponsorship of the show. We do appreciate it. That's going to do it for this one. We'll see you next week.
All right, so for LR After Dark here, I want to mention some other ways Mirage broke ground and continued an important legacy in Magic. I advise you to look up the art on these cards as I talk about them. That will help you give you the full context. Uktabi Orangutan, for example, was famous for not only being a very powerful card, 2 and a green, 2/2, destroy an artifact on ETB, but also colloquially known as sex monkeys, because in the background there's clearly 2 monkeys just completely going at it. It's just unquestionable.
It's true.
Another banger from Mirage that again you really want to look up is Ikundu Cyclops. Ikundu Cyclops. Robert Bliss has some pretty fantastic art. It's very evocative, and I think Ikundu Cyclops has some interesting background additions that are certainly worth taking a look at.
And it is definitely intentional. Like it's not an accident.
I have no doubt of that. I just give the artist props for getting that by who was supposed to approve it. So those are some examples of Mirage. Of course, Alpha did start with Earthbind, so you could say that this was the here from the beginning. And then another banger on this list, if you look up a Clergy and Vec, especially when paired with the flavor text, it's quite a wild ride as well. And we this list wouldn't be complete without everyone's favorite Armada Worm, which has certainly a lot of action going on. So let's just say Magic art, I really appreciate that it's good for a wide variety of audiences, tastes, and interests. And Mirage really was a step forward with both Uktabi Orangutan and a Kundu Cyclops. So enjoy.